Victor Hale thought he was about to entertain wealthy clients by humiliating a harmless old woman, but he had no idea that the small painted kite in her hands would make Lisbon call before sunset. The private preview at Hale and Mercer Gallery had been designed to feel untouchable. White wine moved quietly through crystal glasses. Soft jazz drifted from hidden speakers. The marble floor shone beneath track lights aimed at canvases priced higher than most homes. Men in tailored jackets spoke in low voices about acquisitions, tax shelters, and legacy. Women in silk scarves paused before abstract paintings as if every brushstroke required their approval. At the center of it all stood Victor Hale, 51, silver-haired, pale-skinned, and polished down to the cufflinks. He had built his reputation on taste, or at least on making rich people believe he had it. Victor knew how to tilt his head at a painting, how to pause before naming a price, how to make silence feel expensive. That evening, he was performing beautifully. A critic from Manhattan had just laughed at one of his remarks. A museum patron from Boston had asked to be placed first on a waiting list. Victor's smile was thin, controlled, victorious. Then the glass door opened, and the room seemed to lose half a degree of warmth. Eleanor Whitman stepped inside carrying a long, narrow bundle wrapped in faded linen. She was 72, white-haired, pale-skinned, dressed in a cream cardigan, a modest navy skirt, and brown walking shoes that looked as if they had crossed more church basements than galleries. She paused near the entrance, not because she was afraid, but because she understood rooms like this. Rooms where people measured worth before hearing a voice. Her hands rested gently around the bundle, protective but not desperate. Megan Carter, the youngest gallery assistant, noticed her first and walked over with a professional smile. "Good evening, ma'am. Are you here for the preview?" Eleanor looked around at the glowing walls, the quiet money, the careful faces. "Not exactly," she said softly. "I was hoping someone could look at something for me, just to tell me whether it should be preserved." Before Megan could answer, Victor's eyes landed on the linen bundle. His expression changed almost imperceptibly, the way a curtain shifts when someone passes behind it. He saw the cardigan, the old shoes, the uncertain invitation in her voice, and decided what she was before she had finished breathing. "Megan," he called, smooth as varnish. "We're in the middle of a collector preview." A few guests turned. Eleanor did not flinch. She simply unfolded the linen enough to reveal the edge of a painted kite, its paper aged to the color of weak tea, its wooden ribs thin, its surface brushed with blue and silver marks that shimmered faintly under the gallery lights. Victor stared at it for half a second, then gave a small laugh meant for the room to hear. "Well," he said, stepping closer, "that is certainly unexpected." The room followed his gaze. Conversations thinned. Glasses lowered. Eleanor held the kite with both hands, steady as a prayer. Victor smiled wider, already tasting the little performance he was about to give. He thought he was looking at a piece of sentimental junk. He did not yet know he was standing 3 feet from history. Victor reached for the kite, as if he were accepting a damp napkin from a child. He did not ask Eleanor whether the paper was fragile. He did not ask where it came from. He did not ask why the linen had been wrapped around it with such care. He simply pinched one corner between 2 fingers and lifted it toward the light while the guests arranged themselves into a loose half circle, eager for whatever judgment he was about to deliver. "You said you wanted to know whether it should be preserved," he said, letting the words float with theatrical patience. "That depends on what you believe preservation is for." A man near the wine table gave a quiet chuckle. Eleanor watched the kite rise in Victor's hand, her eyes steady but her shoulders slightly tightened. The painted surface looked plain at first glance, almost childish. A soft blue curve crossed one wing. Silver marks scattered near the lower edge. Along the right corner, nearly hidden beneath a veil of age and dust, sat a small dark mark no larger than a dime. To anyone passing by, it might have looked like a smudge. To Eleanor, it was the reason she had taken 2 buses and walked 6 blocks through the cold November wind to reach this room. "It belonged to my father," she said. "He kept it wrapped for almost 60 years. Victor glanced at the guests, then back at her. "Family objects can feel very important," he replied. "But sentimental value and artistic value are not the same thing." The sentence landed gently, but the insult beneath it was sharp. Megan Carter shifted beside the reception desk, her fingers tightening around her tablet. She had heard Victor speak that way before, always with a smile, always when the person in front of him did not look like someone who could push back. Eleanor nodded once, as if she had expected no better. I understand that, she said. That is why I came to ask, not to claim. Victor tilted the kite, studying it for the room rather than for truth. The paper is old, yes. The frame is handmade, likely cedar or pine, nothing unusual. The paint is decorative. Folk style, perhaps coastal. Maybe a craft piece from a market. He smiled toward a woman in a pearl necklace. Charming, in the way old postcards are charming. More laughter moved through the gallery, not loud, but enough to warm Victor's confidence. Eleanor looked down at the marble floor, not in shame, but in memory. Her father's hands had been careful hands. He had taught her never to argue with people who needed an audience to feel tall. Still, when Victor began to lower the kite toward a side table cluttered with empty glasses, Eleanor spoke quietly. Please do not place it there. The humidity from the glasses may disturb the surface. Victor froze for half a beat. Megan looked up. Eleanor continued. The blue has already migrated near the lower seam, and the silver is not modern acrylic. It reacts poorly to moisture. The room lost a little of its amusement. Victor's smile returned, thinner this time. You seem to have read a conservation brochure, he said. Eleanor met his eyes. No, I have spent a long time listening to people who knew how fragile beautiful things can be. For the first time, Victor did not answer immediately. The silence was small, but everyone felt it. Victor recovered quickly because men like him rarely allowed embarrassment to remain visible for more than a second. He placed the kite on a clean viewing table, not because Eleanor had asked, but because the room had noticed that she knew something he had not expected her to know. Very thoughtful, he said, his voice polished again. But a little terminology does not turn a keepsake into a work of art. He turned toward the guests, inviting them back into his confidence. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a common misunderstanding. People inherit objects, attach stories to them, and then imagine museums are waiting by the telephone. A few people smiled, but the laughter came softer now. Eleanor stood beside the table, hands folded, eyes lowered toward the painted surface, as if she were listening to a voice no one else could hear. Megan stepped closer, pretending to adjust the lighting, but really studying the lower right corner where the dark mark rested beneath the silver paint. It was not random. She could see that now. It curved inward like a letter folded into another letter, deliberate, controlled, almost hidden on purpose. Mrs. Whitman, Megan asked gently, did your father ever say where he received it? Victor's jaw tightened at the interruption. Eleanor looked at Megan with a small gratitude that barely touched her face. Near Lisbon, she said. He was stationed overseas for a time after the war. He did not speak much about it, but he told me this was given to him by a painter who had lost his studio in a fire. A man in a charcoal suit raised his eyebrows. Someone near the back murmured, Lisbon? Victor gave a dry laugh. Every old object has a romantic country attached to it eventually. Paris, Florence, Lisbon. It helps the story breathe. He leaned closer to the kite and tapped the air above it, careful not to touch now that others were watching. But story is not provenance. Provenance requires documentation, ownership history, letters, records, bills of sale, institutional references. Not a family memory. Eleanor accepted the correction without blinking. That is why I brought the envelope, she said. From her worn leather purse, she removed a small bundle of papers tied with a faded blue ribbon. The movement was so quiet that it made the room lean in. Victor stared at the envelope as if it had insulted him. My father kept these with it, Eleanor continued. I do not know if they matter. Megan reached out, but Victor took the papers first, needing to control the moment. He opened them with a skeptical sigh. Inside were 3 yellowed photographs, a folded letter, and a small card with Portuguese writing in blue ink. Victor scanned them quickly, ready to dismiss them, but one photograph slowed him down. It showed a much younger man in an American military jacket standing beside a thin, dark-haired painter in front of a narrow street, tiled walls behind them, the river visible in the distance. Between them, held upright in the sun, was the same kite, the same blue curve, the same silver marks, the same hidden corner. The gallery became still enough to hear the air system humming above the lights. Victor placed the photograph down, but his fingers were no longer casual. Megan saw it. Eleanor saw it. And for the first time that evening, the great Victor Hale looked at the painted kite as if it might be looking back. Victor held the photograph a second too long, and that was enough for the room to understand that something had shifted. He cleared his throat, placed it beside the kite, and reached for the folded letter with the careful irritation of a man searching for a flaw. "Old photographs can be charming," he said, though his voice had lost some of its velvet. "But they do not authenticate an object. Families often misremember. Soldiers collected souvenirs. Street painters gave away sketches. It happens." Eleanor nodded gently. Of course. That calm answer bothered him more than any argument could have. He unfolded the letter. The paper was thin and yellow at the creases, written in careful English by a hand that had learned the language late but respected every word. Victor read only the first lines before his mouth tightened. Megan, standing close enough to see, noticed the signature at the bottom, Adrian Vale. Her breath caught. She had seen that name. Once during graduate school, buried in a lecture about missing European modernists, artists whose final works had disappeared during political unrest, poverty, or exile. Adrian Vale was not famous to casual collectors, but to certain museums, his lost period had become almost mythical. Victor saw Megan's expression and snapped the letter partly closed. "This is not useful without expert review," he said quickly. A woman with silver earrings stepped closer. "What does it say?" Victor smiled at her, but the smile was now a locked door. Nothing conclusive. Eleanor looked at him, not accusing, just waiting. That made him angrier. He had expected confusion from her, maybe embarrassment, maybe gratitude for his attention. Instead, she stood there as if the gallery, the money, the reputation, and the laughter had already become very small things. "Mrs. Whitman," he said, loud enough for the guests, "let me be direct. Even if this object has some interesting background, it is still a painted kite. Museums are not built around every fragile curiosity with a touching story." The insult returned, sharper now because fear had entered it. He turned to the crowd and lifted one hand as if restoring order. "This is why professional distance matters. We cannot let emotion dress up craft as fine art." Eleanor's eyes moved to the small dark mark in the corner. "That mark is not decoration," she said. "My father called it a mercy mark." Someone whispered the phrase. Victor laughed, but too quickly. "A mercy mark. How poetic." Eleanor touched the edge of the linen, not the kite. He said the painter used it when he could not sign his own name. Megan looked up. "A concealed maker's mark." Victor shot her a warning glance. "Megan." But the young assistant had already seen too much to pretend. She pulled a slim ultraviolet penlight from a drawer beneath the viewing table, the kind used for quick condition checks on paper. "We could look," she said quietly. The gallery seemed to inhale. Victor's face hardened. "That is unnecessary." Eleanor did not move. "If it is only a craft piece," she said, her voice soft enough to make everyone listen harder, "then the light will prove you." "Right." Victor stared at her. Around him, collectors watched with polished curiosity, but beneath it was something more dangerous to his pride, expectation. He had built the evening to display his authority. Now an old woman in worn shoes had placed that authority under a light he did not want turned on. After a long silence, Victor gave a thin smile. "Very well," he said. "Let us end this properly." Megan dimmed the nearest lamp. The white walls cooled. The jazz seemed to fade. As the ultraviolet glow passed over the kite's silver corner, the hidden mark began to wake. Megan held the ultraviolet light steady, and the silver corner of the kite changed before everyone's eyes. What had looked like scattered decoration began to separate into lines, each one rising from beneath the old paint with quiet precision. A curved shoreline appeared first, then the outline of a narrow harbor, then three tiny arches like windows facing water. The guests leaned closer without meaning to. Even Victor leaned in, his face pale beneath the gallery lights. The room that had laughed at Eleanor only minutes earlier now watched the fragile paper as if it were breathing. Megan moved the light slowly from right to left. More hidden ink surfaced, faint green beneath the blue, then a small bird shape near the lower seam. Then three interlocked letters so delicate they seemed impossible to have survived the years. A man near the back whispered, "That is not random." No one corrected him. Victor swallowed, but he forced a laugh through his nose. "Interesting underdrawing," he said. "Still, Many decorative objects have hidden sketches. It does not mean we are looking at anything significant. Eleanor said nothing. Her silence had become stronger than his explanations. Megan's hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from recognition. She set the ultraviolet light down and reached for her tablet. The bird, she said. I have seen that symbol before. Victor turned sharply. Megan, enough. But she had already opened a conservation archive she had saved from her graduate research. Her thumb moved quickly across the screen until she found the image, a faded catalog note from a Lisbon institute, showing a small swallow mark used by Adrian Vale during his final undocumented years. The symbol was almost identical. The only difference was that the mark on Eleanor's kite had a small break in the wing, a variation mentioned in the archive as belonging to works considered lost. Megan looked from the tablet to the kite, and the color left her face. This variation, she said quietly, was only documented in letters. No confirmed object has ever been found with it. The words landed harder than any shout. Victor reached for the tablet, but Megan did not hand it over immediately. For the first time, she was not looking at him for permission. Who did you say your contact was in Lisbon? Eleanor asked. Megan blinked, surprised by the calmness of the question. A professor at the Institute for Atlantic Modern Art, Dr. Isabel Morgan. She helped review my thesis. Victor straightened. We are not calling anyone during a private preview over an unverified object. Eleanor turned to him with the same quiet dignity she had carried from the moment she entered. You were willing to judge it in public, she said. Surely you can verify it in public. A hush fell over the gallery. One collector lowered his wine glass onto a tray without taking his eyes off Victor. Another woman stepped closer to the table, her expression no longer amused but ashamed. Victor's smile flickered, searching for the room and finding it had moved away from him. Megan took a photograph of the mark, then another of the letter, then one of the old photographs showing the young soldier and the painter by the river. Her fingers hovered over the send button. Victor opened his mouth to stop her, but Eleanor spoke first, softer than all of them. My father said the painter told him that beauty sometimes hides because pride is too loud to hear it. Megan pressed send. The message left the gallery in silence, traveling farther than Victor's reputation ever had. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the telephone on the reception desk began to ring. The ring cut through the gallery like a small bell in a courtroom. No one moved at first. The sound came again, sharper this time, from the reception desk where Megan's tablet still glowed beside the photographs. Victor looked at the telephone, then at the guests, then at Eleanor, as if somehow she had arranged the timing to humiliate him. Megan walked to the desk and answered with a voice that tried to remain professional. Hale and Mercer Gallery, this is Megan Carter. She listened for less than 3 seconds before her posture changed. Her shoulders straightened. Her eyes lifted toward Eleanor. Yes, Dr. Morgan. I sent them. They are in front of me now. Victor crossed the floor quickly, his shoes clicking against the marble. Put it on speaker, he said, attempting to sound in control, but the command came out too tight. Megan hesitated. Eleanor simply looked at the kite, calm and still. Megan pressed the speaker button. A woman's voice filled the room, accented by years abroad but clearly American. Do not touch the object again unless you are wearing conservation gloves. Keep it flat. Keep it away from direct heat, moisture, and unnecessary light. Is the owner present? Every face turned to Eleanor. Megan answered, yes. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman is here. There was a pause on the line, then the voice softened. Mrs. Whitman, I am Dr. Isabel Morgan from the Institute for Atlantic Modern Art in Lisbon. I need to ask you something very carefully. Is there a letter with the object signed Adrian Vale? Eleanor placed one hand over the ribbon papers. Yes, ma'am. The speaker crackled faintly. And is there an old photograph showing the object near the Tagus River? Yes. Another pause followed, longer this time. It was not empty. It was the sound of a distant expert trying to steady herself before history became real. Victor forced a small laugh. Dr. Morgan, with respect, surely you cannot authenticate something from a few photographs sent during a cocktail preview. The line went quiet. Then Dr. Morgan replied, calm but firm. I have not authenticated it. I have identified features that require immediate professional review. The concealed swallow variation, the coastal mineral blue, and the broken wing mercy mark are all consistent with documents from Vale's final Lisbon period. No, surviving object with that combination has been physically confirmed in the United States. The room went completely silent. Victor's lips parted, but no polished sentence came. Dr. Morgan continued, Mr. Hale, if this object is what it appears to be, it is not a souvenir. It may be one of the missing transitional works scholars have searched for since 1968. A woman near the viewing table covered her mouth. The man in the charcoal suit slowly set his glass down as if even the sound might damage the moment. Megan looked at Eleanor with visible awe. Eleanor did not smile. Her eyes had grown distant, as though she were seeing her father again at the kitchen table, carefully unwrapping the kite once a year, telling her that some promises had to outlive the people who made them. Victor stared at the fragile paper he had mocked only minutes earlier. The blue curve now looked less like decoration and more like a horizon. The silver marks looked less like childish sparkle and more like a hidden language waiting for the first humble person in the room to listen. Dr. Morgan asked Megan to send one more photograph, this time of the full surface under normal light, and the gallery obeyed with the tense silence of people who had suddenly realized they were standing too close to something sacred. Victor remained beside the viewing table, his hands lowered, his mouth arranged into a careful line that no longer looked like confidence. He wanted to speak, to reclaim the room, to remind everyone that Hale and Mercer was his gallery, his reputation, his floor beneath their polished shoes. But every word he considered sounded smaller than the fragile kite resting under the soft white light. Dr. Morgan's voice returned through the speaker. Mrs. Whitman, may I ask how your father came to possess this? Eleanor looked at the old photograph, and for the first time that evening, her composure softened into memory. He was 24 when he was stationed near Portugal after the war, she said. He was not an art man. He fixed radios, carried tools, wrote letters home to my grandmother, and said the ocean in Lisbon sounded different from the ocean in Maine. A faint, tender smile moved across her face. One evening, he followed smoke down a narrow street and found a painter carrying things out of a damaged studio. My father helped him move what he could. A table, 2 crates, a stack of paper. He said the man kept apologizing, not for losing his work, but for not being able to save the colors. No one interrupted her. Even the guests who had laughed earlier now stood with their heads slightly bowed, as if the story had made them aware of their own posture. Eleanor continued, Before my father left, the painter gave him this kite. He said it was made for a child who never got to fly it. He told my father that if anyone ever called it worthless, he should wait for someone kinder to look again. Megan's eyes glistened. Dr. Morgan was quiet on the line. Victor shifted his weight, uncomfortable beneath the weight of a memory he had tried to turn into a joke. Mrs. Whitman, Dr. Morgan said at last. That sentence appears in one of Vale's letters from 1949. He wrote that small things were the only place grief could hide without being confiscated. A breath moved through the room. It was not quite a gasp. It was the sound of arrogance losing its audience. Victor looked down at the ribbon papers, then at Eleanor. Why bring it here? He asked, his voice lower now, no longer theatrical. Eleanor met his eyes without bitterness. Because my father passed away last spring. He asked me to find out whether the kite needed care. Not whether it could make money. Not whether it could impress people. Just whether it needed care. The simplicity of it struck harder than accusation. Dr. Morgan then spoke again, more formal now. Mrs. Whitman, our institute would like to arrange an emergency conservation assessment. We can coordinate with a partner museum in New York within 24 hours. Until then, please keep the object exactly where it is and allow no handling except by trained staff. Victor flinched slightly at the word trained. Megan noticed. So did several collectors. The great dealer who had mocked an old woman for carrying a painted kite now stood silently while Lisbon gave instructions in his own gallery. Eleanor touched the linen beside the kite, not to claim victory, but to reassure the promise she had carried for 60 years. Around her, the room had changed. The wine glasses looked foolish. The price tags looked loud. And the little dark mark in the corner no longer seemed hidden at all. Within minutes, the preview no longer felt like a preview. It felt like a witness room. Megan brought out cotton gloves and an archival support board from the storage cabinet, moving with a seriousness Victor had never encouraged in her, but now depended on. She placed the board beside the viewing table and waited for Dr. Morgan's instructions through the speaker. Slide the support beneath it without lifting the paper, Dr. Morgan said. Slowly. No pressure on the lower right corner. Megan obeyed. Eleanor watched every movement with her hands clasped at her waist, her wedding band catching a thin line of light. Victor stood nearby, useless in a place where only care mattered. That seemed to trouble him more than the embarrassment. For years, he had believed expertise meant speaking first, pricing fastest, deciding who belonged before they finished their sentence. But now, in the center of his own gallery, the most important skill was gentleness, and the person who had shown it from the beginning was the woman he had mocked. A collector named Margaret Ellis stepped forward, her voice subdued. "Mrs. Whitman, I owe you an apology. I laughed earlier." Eleanor turned toward her. There was no triumph in her expression, only a tired kindness. "You stopped," she said. "That matters." The words were so simple that Margaret looked down, ashamed and grateful at the same time. Others shifted uneasily, remembering their smiles, their whispers, the way they had allowed Victor's cruelty to become entertainment. Dr. Morgan asked Megan to read the writing on the small Portuguese card. Megan did, carefully stumbling through the words, then translating the line written beneath the name. "For the man who saved the colors." Dr. Morgan exhaled softly over the speaker. "That matches the family accounts." Vale mentioned an American who helped him after the studio damage. "We never knew his name." Eleanor's eyes filled, but she did not cry. She touched the folded photograph of her father with 2 fingers, the gesture small enough to be private, even in a room full of people. "His name was Thomas Whitman," she said. "He would have liked that someone remembered." Victor finally stepped closer. The confidence had drained from him, leaving behind a man suddenly aware of how little polish could protect him from the truth. "Mrs. Whitman," he began, then stopped because the old version of his voice did not fit the moment. He tried again. "Eleanor, I was wrong." The room waited. He looked at the kite, then at her worn shoes, then at the guests who had trusted his judgment more than their conscience. "I treated you with disrespect. I dismissed your object without proper care. I made a spectacle of something I did not understand." Eleanor studied him quietly. For one breath, Victor seemed to hope forgiveness would come quickly enough to rescue him. It did not. Eleanor only said, "You did not just misunderstand the kite. You misunderstood why people bring precious things to someone like you." That sentence settled over him with more force than anger could have carried. Dr. Morgan then announced that a New York conservation partner had agreed to receive the object the next morning, and that a Lisbon team would fly in within 2 days. The gallery murmured, stunned by the speed of it. Victor looked around the room he had built to impress important people, and realized the most important person there had arrived in a cream cardigan, carrying history in faded linen. By the next morning, the tone of Hale and Mercer Gallery had changed so completely that even the marble seemed quieter. The white wine had been cleared away. The jazz was gone. In its place came the soft sounds of careful footsteps, cotton gloves, archival paper, and lowered voices. A conservation specialist from the New York Partner Museum arrived at 9:15, carrying a flat case and speaking with the kind of respect Victor had failed to show when respect had cost nothing. Eleanor returned wearing the same cream cardigan, her hair pinned neatly, her worn leather purse held close. At her side, Megan met her at the door, not as a gatekeeper, but as someone honored to open it. "Mrs. Whitman," she said, "they are ready for you." Eleanor looked past her to the viewing table where the kite rested on its support board, no longer treated like an inconvenience, no longer balanced near empty glasses, no longer mocked as a little craft from someone who did not belong. Victor stood a few feet away in a dark suit that looked more severe than elegant. He had spent the night answering calls from collectors who had been in the room, from board members who had heard what happened, from one museum advisor who asked why an elderly woman had to defend the dignity of an object before a professional would examine it properly. Reputation, Victor discovered, could be damaged not by scandal alone, but by one clear moment when everyone saw the truth. When Eleanor approached, he stepped aside. Not dramatically, not for show, just enough to make space. "Mrs. Whitman," he said, "Dr. Morgan sent a formal letter this morning. The Institute believes the object may be eligible for temporary study in Lisbon, if you agree." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Yesterday, his voice had turned the room against her. Today, it had nowhere to hide. My father wanted it cared for, she said. If Lisbon can help do that, then Lisbon may see it. The conservation specialist smiled gently. We will document every step. Ownership remains yours unless you choose otherwise. Eleanor nodded, then looked down at the kite. Under the morning light, the blue curve seemed calmer, almost like water at dawn. The broken wing mark in the corner was barely visible again, but everyone in the room knew it was there. That was the thing about truth. It did not need to shout once it had been seen. Megan placed the old photograph and letter into a protective sleeve, hands steady now. Victor watched her with something close to humility. Megan, he said quietly, you were right to send the photographs. She looked at him, surprised. He added, and I was wrong to stop you. The apology did not erase what had happened, but it changed the air around it. Eleanor heard him, yet her eyes stayed on the kite. People often think age makes things smaller, she said. Old paper, old stories, old women. But sometimes age is just proof that something survived the careless. No one answered. There was nothing to add. 2 days later, when Dr. Isabel Morgan arrived from Lisbon, she stood before the kite with tears in her eyes and whispered Thomas Whitman's name as she entered it into the Institute record. Not as an owner, not as a collector, as the man who saved the colors. Victor Hale watched from the back of the room, silent, while Eleanor signed the temporary loan agreement with a hand that did not tremble. The gallery that had laughed at her now stood still around her. And as the fragile painted kite was lifted into its protective case, every person there understood that dignity does not arrive dressed for approval. Sometimes it walks in quietly, wrapped in faded linen, waiting for arrogance to finish speaking.